Good morning and welcome to our monthly health and wellness webinar with Dr. Greg Charlop, and we are here from the Women's Sports Forum. My name is Miriam Glaze. I'm the founder of Athlete Soul. I'm also supporting the Women's Sports Forum, and I'm here to moderate this discussion with Dr. Greg. We had an excellent discussion last month with Nicola Kay and Dr. Greg on female hormone, and this month we are now talking about nutrition specifically for female athletes, and we're going to be answering a lot of questions that we received from our previous audiences. And you can also ask questions during this discussion. I encourage you to do this in the Q&A box or in the chat box. We'll take note of them and then we'll answer them throughout that conversation. Remember that this event is recorded. You will receive the recording after the event, and you can also find the recording of this event and the previous events on the Women's Sports Forum, as well as Athlete Soul's website as well. So I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Greg to introduce himself and talk to us a little bit about the Women's Sports Forum as well before we get started.
Hi, thank you, Miriam. Thanks for being with me. It's Dr. Greg Charlop here. I just realized I probably should have cut my hair before this, but thank you so much for being here. And as you know, this is part of our monthly Women's Sports Forum Health and Wellness Q&A. And the point of these is we're trying to help women athletes, collegiate, professional, even retired, or just weekend warriors, to learn how you can improve your health and improve your performance and feel better. And we think that women athletes deserve better, and right now they're really not getting a fair shake through most other sources. So our efforts here today are really geared towards women and to your health needs, although obviously some nutritional things apply to men and women. We'll talk about that today when it comes up. But thank you so much for joining. The Women's Sports Forum is a project that involves a number of people, and the ultimate goal is to help empower women athletes. And we urge you to join with us. We have some exciting projects on the way, including potentially a TV show and a book, and this regular content series and more stuff coming soon. So thank you so much for joining the Women's Sports Forum, because we think women athletes deserve better.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for all your effort on that topic, because obviously it's something I care about. Being a retired female athlete and an Olympian, there's definitely hasn't been as much resources and information available to female athletes. So I'm going to jump right in. Our topic of discussion today is nutrition. We have a few questions already, so I'll get started with the first one. But again, if you would like to ask questions, you can do that throughout the morning, and please do so in the Q&A box. So first question that we got, Greg, is should nutrition be different for male and female athletes?
Yes, and thank you for this question. This is really the whole reason we're here today, which is when you look up nutrition on the web or when you speak to people about sports nutrition, it's almost always either generic or geared towards men. It's very rare that when we talk about sports nutrition, it actually has a woman focus. And so that's why I'm glad you asked that, because that's really the goal of today and really the goal of the Women's Sports Forum. And so it turns out, and one of our panelists said this, and I love this, is that women are not just little men. They're different. Their needs are different nutritionally, and we see that. So it is true, on average, women are smaller than men. So when you compare, let's say, a woman athlete's needs, say a woman track runner, for example, versus a male track runner, the woman will need fewer total calories than the man, and the women would need fewer, total protein and total fat than the man would as well. Having said that, a lot of times women are really undernourished. And we see this a lot with women athletes. Women athletes are often very undernourished, and this is typically more of a problem for women than men. So even though they tend to need less, they get even less than that. And so this leads to this sort of women's athlete triad that we often see, where you have women athletes that are not getting enough calories or not getting enough nutrition, and this leads to bad stuff. It leads to having irregular or even a loss of periods. It leads to osteoporosis, and it leads to long-term health problems. So when you're looking up nutrition, and it's difficult to go through in the video here, but I want to emphasize to you, if you're a woman athlete, when you're looking up nutritional recommendations, make sure they are women-based, because there are somewhat different protein needs and total calorie needs. And it also, frankly, depends on your sport and what your weight is right now. But in addition to that, I think we'll talk more about this later, but micronutrients. Women can often be, and I know we'll talk about this later, they may be iron deficient, which is something that needs to be checked for. It tends to be more of a problem for women than for men. And there are other micronutrients, B vitamins and things like that, that women sometimes need more of, and they simply don't get them.
Greg, this is really interesting because we talked about this last week, the fluctuation through the cycle, how women have different needs to men, and they also could have different needs throughout the months than men have. Would that be correct from a nutritional intake as well? Should your diet, your intake be fluctuating with your cycle through the months?
That's a good question. And a lot of times for many women, the answer is probably yes. But I think that it's individualized. Some women find that during certain times of the month or during certain points in their cycle, certain foods are less appealing or more appealing. And I would encourage women athletes, this is one of the great things of being an athlete. You know your body better than anyone else. And so you have a good sense of what your needs are during the month. And if you feel that you need more calories at a certain time, or you don't want to eat a certain type of food at a certain time, I encourage you to listen to your body, because your body is telling you this. And your body is advising you what to eat, and you should listen. And athletes really kind of have a gift listening to their bodies much better. I would encourage you, when it comes to that, to listen to your bodies. Having said that, and we'll get more into this with the iron again, but for example, if you're a woman who has very heavy periods, that's something you should be in tune to. And that may lead you to being at risk, let's say, for iron deficiency or for anemia. And you want to watch out for that. If you're a woman athlete and you're thinking about pregnancy, this is a very big conversation, totally beyond the scope of what we could talk about today. But that's something you really want to work with your nutritionist and your obstetrician for, because your caloric needs during pregnancy are vastly different than normal. And for an athlete, it's even more complicated. So for something like that, you'll definitely want to speak to I would recommend, if you're an athlete, having both a nutritionist and an obstetrician.
So Greg, yes, things are very individualized, depending on the person, the sport, their activity level, the time of the month. Should a female athlete consider taking supplement to complement their nutrition?
So I'm a fan of a limited number of supplements. And in my individual practice, when I work with athletes, there are certain ones that I recommend. And one of them is creatine. So I think for most people, creatine is a great supplement. I take it myself. I recommend it to almost everybody. And it has a lot of benefits. And in fact, what's interesting is they've looked at creatine specifically in terms of how it affects women athletes. And they've looked at women soccer players, for example, and they found that creatine increases muscle mass. This is for women. Increases muscle mass, increases muscle strength, improves sports performance, improves athletic performance across a whole bunch of different measures, and it doesn't make you fat, which I know a lot of people are worried about. And so for a lot of women, including many women that are doing aesthetic sports, I recommend creatine. It also actually, some interesting stuff about it. It may be good for you long-term, maybe good for your brain. It turns out that creatine might help protect you if you've had a concussion. If you're, say, women's soccer, for example, unfortunately, it's notorious for concussion. So if you're a women's soccer player, I really recommend it, both because it's been studied in women's soccer players and because you're at risk for concussions. But also, even long-term, there's some thought that it may help protect your brain as we age. So creatine, definitely. Another thing I recommend is a multivitamin with iron. You don't need to go overboard with the iron. You don't need tons of it for most people, but I think a multivitamin is it's a safe thing to do. I don't think you lose anything with it. As long as it's one of those ones that sort of close to 100% of the recommended dose for most things, I recommend a multivitamin. Everything else is kind of touchy-feely. You know, I think turmeric is good for most people. It's probably good for your joints. It probably reduces inflammation. Certainly in your retirement years, I would definitely recommend that. I recommend most people add olive oil to your diet. I don't know if you call that a supplement or not, but I just intentionally add it to things. So olive oil is a good one, and I would do that. You know, once you get beyond that, you know, there's all kinds of data for certain things or other things, but it's kind of debatable. But multivitamins, I think for sure, creatine for sure, turmeric most likely. The other things, it's sort of hit or miss.
Greg, this is really interesting for me because for a long time creatine was forbidden in a country like France, and I think it is still today for athletes. It's still considered as a doping. But I have seen a lot of athletes in other countries use it. So it's really interesting that this is something you recommend. And I'm quite frankly surprised. So it's really interesting to hear that. We have a question from one of our participants. Susan is asking, she is a coach. She has runners with disordered eating, one who avoids gluten and animal protein, how to address the importance of nutrition as a competitor when this is out of my scope of practice. A very common question for a lot of coaches. They're like pulling their hair out, right? Because they have athletes with unhealthy eating habits and they can't really address it.
Yeah, I'm really glad that question was asked. That's, you know, it's funny because that actually kind of came up even last month, not so much with nutrition, but you'll remember kind of with hormones and pregnancy, it was the same thing as coaches want to help their players, but they often aren't sure what to do, or they feel a little powerless about it, which makes perfect sense. And, you know, it's a bind as a coach, right? Because you're not a doctor, you're not a nutritionist, but there are certain tips I would give you. One of them is, you really have to be careful, especially in the aesthetic sports, about not, I'm just editorializing here, not pushing so much that you may be leading, especially younger girls, especially if you have girls as the people you're coaching, leading them into eating disorders, because it's possible to nitpick people's food so much that you actually cause the problem. And so the solution isn't to make fun of eating or to make eating shameful or to make people feel that they need to go into the closet to eat, which a lot of women athletes do, because that could lead to things like anorexia and bulimia, and it leads to an unhealthy relationship with food. So I think as a coach, the first thing I would say is, and we say this in medicine, is do no harm. Make sure that your words are not leading people to feel shame with food, because that isn't what you want to do, and it's not serving the girls or the women you're working with at all. But beyond that, you know, I think that there are a number of things as a coach that you could do. If you notice someone with disordered eating, they're losing too much weight, they tell you that they're missing their periods, for example, I would encourage them to go speak to their nutritionist or their doctor. I mean, this is hard to do in small organizations, but in larger ones, I really think having a nutritionist on staff is a wise thing to do, or to have someone like me or someone who does the kind of stuff that we do, kind of look at your organization and see, are you kind of providing the right foods? Are you providing the right guidance for food? But I think, you know, as a coach, really the best thing is don't do any harm. Recommend they see a nutritionist if they're missing periods or they're losing too much weight. And, you know, another tip off that we'll see is when women aren't eating enough, a lot of times their performance will drop off. So if someone, maybe they seem skinny, you don't notice them eating that much, their performance is declining, or they're missing practices, or they're calling in sick a lot, or they're having a lot of these weird, unexpected health problems. And it's not typical for them, that could be a sign of an eating disorder. And again, you'll want to ask them to go speak to a nutritionist or go speak to their doctor. You don't want to ignore that.
But you do recommend to not getting involved in the discussion that becomes discussing their diet and the content of their nutrition, right?
I'm not a big fan of it. I know people turn to their coaches, and for smaller leagues, the coach, they wear every hat, right? So the coach is the coach, they're the nutritionist, they're the psychologist. They may even be like the financial advisor. And so I understand as a coach, you often wear many hats, and sometimes you may be pressed. But the thing about nutrition is the recommendations change so much. I remember, it's sort of funny. I remember this because I've always loved nutrition. I remember when I was younger, there was this whole big thing that fat is bad. And I remember this, I was a teenager, I think at the time, and everybody was like, fat is terrible. You don't want to eat fat. And so I remember this, I loved Oreos. And so at the time they came out with these reduced fat Oreo cookies. Do you remember those? They were like 35% less fat or something, with a green stripe. And so I'm like, this is awesome. I can eat all the Oreos I want because there's less fat. And so I would literally polish off like a massive thing of Oreos because I love them. And I thought it was like a guilt-free thing because they didn't have, as much fat. Now we realize that sugar in most cases is probably way worse than fat. Plus there wasn't much of a fat reduction anyways. So I got totally taken to the cleaners by all those Oreo cookies. And so, I think that it's so easy to get fooled by nutrition, and the recommendations change so much. I would recommend going to a professional if there's something that worries you.
I want to address a portion of her question was related to specific diet. And so can you talk to us a little bit about whether it's okay to be a vegetarian or a vegan when you're an athlete and a female athlete?
Yes, I love this question actually. And so I'm vegetarian, I'm pescatarian, I guess, myself. And so I'm a big fan of this diet. I really try to minimize my animal products. And anyone listening today, I applaud you if you're doing that as well. I think that there are good reasons from a long-term health standpoint to do this. We know that people that eat more, if you're cutting out meat and you're replacing it with healthy stuff like vegetables and whole grains, we know that your risk of long-term health problems like cancer, diabetes, and a whole bunch of other things is reduced. And so from a long-term health standpoint, if you could pull off a vegan or vegetarian diet, you're way better off for it. It's also better for the environment, and it's better for animal care and for global warming and everything else. So there's a number of reasons to do it, but and you can do it. There are a number of successful vegetarian and vegan athletes, so you can do it. But you must be very careful about doing it because you could do it wrong. And so here are some ways that you could go wrong and some things to look at. One is you're not going to get enough B vitamins. And that's an easy one to solve. B12 in particular, you really get that from animal products. It's hard to get B12 any other way. So if you're a vegetarian or vegan, I recommend taking B12 supplements. And I would just, again, if you take a good multivitamin, that kind of takes care of your B12 problem. You may not get enough iron because you can get iron from vegetable sources like spinach and beans and things like that. But most Americans get most of their iron from meat. So I would recommend making sure there's iron in your supplement. Again, you want to have iron. The other thing is protein. So a lot of vegetarian or vegan athletes are not getting enough protein. And so there's some tricks to this. And this is where I would probably recommend, especially if you're vegan, I would recommend speaking to a nutritionist because it's complicated. But there are some good rules of thumb for protein. One of them is you want to make sure you're getting complete protein. So this is how I kind of think about it. It's a good rule of thumb. If you remember this, you'll get something. There's three main buckets of vegetable protein sources. One of them is nuts, like almonds, sunflowers, things like that, sunflower seeds. The other bucket is legumes. So lentils, chickpeas, hummus, pea protein. And then the third one are grains. So that would be like wheat, rice, barley, that kind of stuff. It turns out that when you combine two of those three things together, you're getting a complete protein, meaning you're getting all the amino acids you need. So if you're especially a vegan athlete, but even a vegetarian athlete, what I would recommend is you try to combine these things and get multiple sources of vegetable protein throughout the day. So for example, say you have a sandwich with whole wheat bread and almond butter. You've got the nut category and you've got the grain category. So when you combine them, you're getting enough you're getting the right combination of protein. So you want to do stuff like that and watch it. If all you're having is pea protein all day, or all you're doing is eating almonds, that's great, but you're not getting all the proteins. So this can be done. It just takes being thoughtful. It can be very successful, but you just need to, I would recommend speaking to a nutritionist, especially if you're vegan.
Great, that was really well explained, and I like the combination of the two to know that you're getting the complete protein, because I think for a lot of vegan, that's the question that comes back all the time is I'm getting protein, but is it the complete protein? Does it matter for a female athlete at what time they eat? Does it have an impact on their well-being or their health or even their performance?
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and it's very hotly debated. So I'm going to give you my opinion, and I'm sure you'll find people that will disagree. But first of all, I want to say it kind of depends on what kind of athlete you are. So if you are a retired athlete or you're a weekend warrior type athlete, I recommend fasting. Especially say you're 50s, 60s, 70s, well, maybe if you're in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, I recommend fasting. And what I mean by that is if you're able to, I would try to fast for say 12 to 16 hours a day. If you're able to do this, if you have diabetes or something, speak to your doctor first. But I recommend fasting if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, retired weekend warrior. And in terms of, in this category, I'm talking about that. I'm going to break it down by what kind of athlete you are. If you're in the 40s, 50s, 60s age range, you're a weekend warrior, you like to play tennis, you like to go on runs, things like that, try fasting for 12 to 16 hours a day. And if you're able to, you can have some of your light workouts in the morning while you are fasting. And if you do this, the workout will be worse. I'm just going to be honest with you, but it improves your ability to utilize energy, and it might beef up your cells' mitochondria, which are your energy powerhouses, and it might improve your endurance. So I recommend that. Now, if you get dizzy, if you get lightheaded, if your performance is awful, then you'll have to eat something before you work out. Now, if you're an active athlete, say you're a 23-year-old competitive woman, and you're an active professional athlete, or you're a 19-year-old woman in college and you're very active, then fasting is more difficult. You probably cannot do it. And the reason you probably cannot do it is, again, when you have fasted workouts, and I have fasted workouts when I can, because I'm not a competitive athlete, obviously, and so I just want to improve my endurance. If you're a competitive athlete, it's hard to do fasted workouts because your workout just isn't as good. Now, if you work with a trainer and you're thoughtful about it, there's ways you can do a fasted workout as a competitive athlete, but you'll only do it sometimes, and I wouldn't depend on it. You really want to be thoughtful. In general, you probably want to eat something before your workouts if you're competitive. The other problem for competitive athletes is many women competitive athletes don't get enough calories. And so if you're already kind of teetering on the edge of not getting enough calories to begin with, and then you add fasting to the mix, then I worry that a lot of women, especially say endurance athletes or aesthetic athletes, I worry that they just won't be eating enough calories at all. And I could tell you how many times I've seen this, where when you shrink the amount of time in the day you could eat, you generally don't eat as much, which is great for weight loss, but isn't so good for a competitive woman athlete who may barely be getting enough calories anyways. So to summarize, I would say if you're in your maybe late 30s, 40s, 50s, perhaps early 60s, fast for 12 to 16 hours a day, experiment with fasted workouts. If you are a competitive collegiate or a competitive professional athlete, you probably either shouldn't fast or no more than 12 hours, and you want to be thoughtful about it.
Really, really interesting to hear about the fasting versus the non-fasting. And also from my personal experience, I used to eat multiple times a day, or like up to like 10 times a day, because we ate very small portion of food to be able to be comfortable at practice. And I would imagine that a lot of female athletes will probably take that kind of route, that kind of strategy, to feel, light in their training, to feel comfortable not having to be bloated or have reflux when they're like in their practice, like just from a personal comfort. So I think a lot of competitive athletes will end up eating very small portions, but throughout the day, really.
And one thing I want to add to that, because you're right, and this is one of those things where you know your body and you know what bothers you and what doesn't. But the one thing you want to be careful about is carbs, and this is another really controversial topic. Now, we see this a lot. This happens a lot in basketball. If you watch a basketball game, it's true for men and women. If you watch a basketball game, very often teams will come out flat after halftime. And you would think that they'd be great. You think, well, they're rested, they came with a new strategy, they had a motivating talk with the coach. You'd expect them to come out all guns blazing. But a lot of times they come out flat. And I suspect the reason for this is that at the beginning of halftime, they were drinking tons of sugary drinks, or maybe eating, a sugary thing like a banana or something. And so they got this sort of sugar spike and then a sugar crash. And this affects your performance if you're having these sugar crashes during your game, during something competitive. So I recommend if you're eating something before a game or something important, you probably want to eat, if it's a carb, you want to eat something that's more slowly absorbed if you're able to, like whole grains, like say oatmeal or something like that, if you're able to do it, because you're less likely to get the sugar spike and the sugar crash when you need your energy most.
You answered the question I was going to ask you partly, because I was going to talk to you about sports drink. These have become really prevalent. There's a lot of different type of sports drink, and I'm just curious what you think about sport drink and if they're good for female athletes.
So it's a mixed bag. When you're a competitive athlete, you often don't drink enough liquid. And this is a common problem. And the other thing is, when you're a competitive athlete, you often don't get enough electrolytes, things like salts, for example. And so if you're sweating a lot, say you're playing basketball, or you're a marathon runner, or really any kind of endurance sport, or these sort of aggressive sports like basketball, you almost certainly are probably dehydrated, and you almost certainly are losing tons and tons of salt. So you need to replace this. And so I think there's some role for these sports drinks to replace water and to replace salt. The problem is that the sugary sports drinks will give you this sugar high and sugar crash, which can hurt your performance. So I tend to discourage people from having these sugary drinks if they can, because I just don't think it's good for performance. So here's what I recommend. I would experiment with different drinks and see if you can find some that have electrolytes or salts in them, but not that much sugar. And look at your performance and see, is it different 30, 45 minutes after, an hour after? Did avoiding that sugar help you? And my guess is the answer is going to be yes. Now, the other thing is, a lot of those drinks, people get used to drinking during the game, and then they drink it all the time. And it's just a big source of sugar in your diet. And that's something that nobody needs. Women athletes don't need it. I think it's terrible actually for women athletes to have it, because if you're worried about aesthetics and things like that, I don't want you getting your calories from sugar. I want you getting your calories from whole grains and from vegetables and from responsible protein sources and things like that. So if you're in the habit of drinking a sugary sports drink during the game, and then you just keep cases of them in your house and you're drinking it all day long, that's a huge mistake. And I would definitely not do that. The one extra thing I would add, and this is really kind of neat stuff, if you're a competitive female athlete, I recommend speaking to your doctor or your coach or nutritionist about getting something called a continuous glucose monitor. And this is a really cool technology. I recommend this to sports teams when I work with them. And what it does is a little device that's buried under your arm, and it measures your blood sugar in real time. And it allows you to see what your sugar does over the course of the day and in response to foods and things you eat. And so a really cool thing you could do is you can, if you have one of these, and you'll need to work with a professional, if you have one of these, you can actually look at what happens to your blood sugar when you drink a sugary sports drink and see if it goes up and it crashes. And if it does, then you know you should avoid that, because you know for sure that it's not good for you.
Well, this is super interesting. I heard a lot about the sports drink and the sugar, and I think now you can buy electrolytes in packets and actually just dilute that in your water instead of going with the sports drink. I'm not sure that the cost is similar to the sports drink, but that's definitely an alternative that's available. Another thing that we were asked is about the impact of what you eat in the evening on your sleep and the quality of your sleep, as well as your recovery. So one of the athletes was asking, does what you eat in the evening impact your sleep? Is it true? And if so, how does it impact it? And then what should we eat for dinner?
Great question, great question. And this kind of ties in a little bit into fasting, but it's kind of two separate categories. So it turns out that you're better off, I'll get to sleep specifically, but I just want to make this one point. You're better off front loading your calories during the day. In other words, let's say, like for me, for example, I should probably eat, I don't know, 2,000, 2,200 calories a day, somewhere around there. I'm better off having most of those calories early in the day and less calories later in the day. There's a number of studies that show this to be true. So if you're the sort of person that doesn't eat much during the day and has a massive dinner, what you're doing is you're backloading your calories. You're giving yourself most of your calories at the end of the day, and that isn't really the best thing for health overall. Now, I realize if you're an athlete and you have morning practices, for example, or morning competitions, it may be difficult to have a massive meal in the morning because you're getting ready to go train. And like you said, Miriam, before, like you don't necessarily want to have a full stomach right before you're going to do your sport. So I realize that, some of this depends on just your lifestyle and your schedule. But as a general rule, you want your calories earlier in the day rather than later. Now, specifically with sleep, here's what we know. When you have a big meal before bed, your sleep is worse. It is, it's worse. And there's lots of research on this. Your sleep is choppier. The quality of your sleep is worse. It's less restful. And so it's not a good thing to do to have a big meal before bed. So the recommendation is, if you're able to try to wait 4 hours or make it so you're done eating around 4 hours before bedtime, if you can do it. Now, it won't happen every day, I get it, but a big meal right before bed, you get worse sleep. Now, not everybody has reflux, but obviously if you have reflux, and you had mentioned that earlier, and a lot of women athletes do, when you eat a big meal before bed, you'll have more reflux overnight. And that can cause you to either, again, have worse sleep, or it might cause you to start popping anti-reflux pills, some of which are really not good to use long-term. And so if you're someone who suffers with reflux at night, if you're someone who suffers with reflux or heartburn, acid indigestion at night, I would experiment with having small dinners earlier in the day and see if that allows you to cut out some of these reflux meds. You may not need them. So that's the thing. And one last thing I want to say about this, and this is really recent research, and it's kind of neat. You know, we talked about this before. Unless you're sick, you know, when was the last time you've had to poop in the middle of the night? It's just not something you do, right? Unless you've had food poisoning or something. It's rare for people, say at like 2 in the morning, to get up and poo, right? I've got kids, I say poo at number 2 or something. So forgive me if it sounds juvenile, but you just don't do it. And the reason why is because your body has different clocks in it. And it's not just your brain and everything, but even your intestines have a clock. And so it turns out that your intestines largely shut off at night. And so when you eat a big meal and then you spring into bed, what happens is that food is just sitting around in your intestines, rotting away, not really moving, just kind of hanging out there. And that's gross, and it's not what you want. So if you're able to do it, I would avoid a big meal before bedtime.
We are really tackling topics that I think have been fairly controversial. Like, we hear certain things as an athlete. You need to eat a big meal of pasta in the evening because you have a competition the next day, or you need to fuel and recover with a big meal at night. You need to drink sports drink during and after your practice. Another one that I'm going to ask you now is about chocolate milk. That's a common recommendation to athletes to drink chocolate milk right after practice. What do you think about that?
Well, if you ask my kids, the answer is definitely, definitely drink chocolate milk after practice. But, you know, here's the thing. For some people tolerate milk a lot better than others. Some people are lactose sensitive, some people aren't. Some people have almost like a mild allergic reaction to milk proteins, and other people don't. So we're all a little bit different in terms of how we could tolerate milk. So I'll use myself as an example here. I don't seem to have any problem with milk. I can drink a large amount of milk. It doesn't give me an upset stomach. And I've actually experimented where I've looked at my energy level and my skin and other things, and I've tracked it, and I've compared it to days where I've had a lot of dairy products and days I haven't. And if you're listening to this at home, I encourage you to do this because you want to see how you react to dairy. It's a great thing to know. And the way to do it is to actually take a dietary log. And you can do it on pen and paper, just write down when you've had dairy and then write down kind of how you feel. There are apps that do it. But I recommend, my first thing is I recommend tracking this. Because here's the thing, your memory and my memory are bad. And, you know, if you're just depending on kind of your general sense, do you feel crummy later if you have milk now? Unless your reaction is terrible, you just won't know. And your memory isn't going to lead you the right way. So the first thing I say is, if you're into this, take a dietary log. You don't have to write the details like you had 8 ounces of milk or 6 ounces of milk, but just write down like a few things. Today I had like a bunch of milk, or I had pizza or something with a bunch of cheese. Write it down, and then write down how you feel, you know, once or twice during the day. And if you have any problems, like if you have diarrhea or you have low energy or you get rashes or something, track this for a week or 2 and see. Now, let's assume that it doesn't seem like dairy causes you any problem. Okay, you're one of the lucky ones, you don't have a lactose problem, milk protein is fine. I would say if you want to have chocolate milk, I think that's okay. And the reason I think it's okay is it actually does have a fair amount of electrolytes, which you need. It's got protein. It has milk fat. Now, this is controversial, and not everyone will agree with me. But I think in general, having a good amount of milk fat in your diet is probably fine. It doesn't worry me. Now, I know there's some disagreement about this, and there's studies both ways, but I don't think that milk fat is particularly harmful. It does have some sugar, so I would try not to get a super high sugary one. But again, you know, if you're having it, you've just worked out, especially if you have it after your workout or after your game, you're probably calorie depleted anyway. So I think it's probably okay, assuming that you're okay with dairy products.
Yeah, it would work as a recovery drink right after practice. Obviously, you're not going to take a a sugary cocoa milk right if you're going to have your meal right after your practice. You would save your appetite for the meal, but that could be, if your meal is later on, you could have the chocolate milk as a recovery for just quick recovery after practice. Another one that we get a lot of question about is coffee. Is it okay to drink coffee? Is there any benefit to performance? We find that a lot of athletes get a boost from drinking coffee, helps them wake up, but also they feel guilty about drinking coffee, thinking that it's addictive and that it will have an impact on their sleep as well.
So it's funny, I was just looking around. Oh yeah, actually I have it right here. Got my coffee mug, you know, so I mean, I just want to answer you by saying, so I just moved here to Georgia, and it took like a month for us to get our furniture, but we drove here. We came from Texas, and so we had just a few things we put in the car. So we had almost no clothes, we had almost no anything, but we did have 2 coffee makers in the car. So I made sure to have that, you know, coming here. And so I'll tell you, I'm a big fan of coffee, and I'm thrilled that people are asking this question. I want to talk about coffee generally for a moment first, and then I'm going to specifically talk about coffee and how that affects athletic performance. So people have gone back and forth. Is coffee good for you? Is coffee not good for you? And people worried about things like, does it cause high blood pressure? Does it cause heart arrhythmias? Does it cause all these things? It doesn't really seem like it does that for the vast majority of people. So if you have reasonable amounts of coffee, I'm not talking about like 10 cups a day, but if you have reasonable amounts of coffee, for almost everybody, it's safe and it's healthy. It seems to be that when you drink, regular coffee drinkers are actually probably protected from heart disease. They're protected from strokes. They may even be protected, this is controversial again, they may even be protected from things like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and degeneration of the brain. Because the coffee has a lot of beneficial compounds, including caffeine, but other things too, and they seem to have a lot of health benefits. For many people, coffee or tea may be one of the biggest sources of antioxidants in their diet. And so coffee is very, very good, both short-term and long-term for most people. We know it improves concentration and the ability to focus. And so coffee really is a very, in my opinion, and I think this is very supported by the evidence, very healthy. Now, one of the things I'm really excited about, and this just came out, and this is particularly important for women, is there was a recent study that found out that when women are diagnosed with breast cancer, the women who are regular coffee drinkers are more likely to survive the breast cancer. And they have a lower overall mortality. Now, I want to say that again. Coffee may actually help improve your survival, both from breast cancer and overall, if you drink it regularly. Now, these studies are correlational, meaning they didn't randomize some people to drinking coffee and some people not. So, you know, nutrition studies are terrible anyways. It may be that the coffee doesn't cause it. It may just be that people that survive drink it. So I can't say that coffee causes you to be more likely to survive, but it's associated with it. And so unless there's a reason not to, if I were a woman, especially someone with breast cancer, I would drink coffee, even though I can't swear for sure that the coffee will help you. The downside of coffee, and again, we'll get to the athletic stuff here in a minute, but just for regular people, when you have it later in the day, it does disrupt sleep. There's no question about it. Now, I've heard people say, and I'm probably one of these people, oh, I could have coffee later in the day and I could still fall asleep. And you might still be able to fall asleep, but your sleep quality will be worse. If you do these, you could do sleep studies and you'll look and you'll see people that drink coffee. This is also true if you drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes, which I hope you don't do before bed. When you drink coffee close to bedtime, you still have a bunch of caffeine in your body. And even if you fall asleep, you have poor sleep quality. So I recommend, as a general thing, you quit the coffee by around noon, although everybody's different. Now, let's get into coffee and athletic performance. There's clear research, including for women athletes in particular, that coffee improves athletic performance. Coffee improves endurance. Coffee seems to improve performance in strength requiring tasks. Coffee improves the ability to read other players' minds, interestingly. So if you're in team sports and you have caffeine, you're sort of more in tune with what's going on, what other players are doing, which is pretty neat. It's better for your mood. It actually, this is not just true for athletes, but for anyone, it reduces the risk of suicide. And in just in many ways, coffee is tremendous for athletic performance. It also improves your sense of well-being. You know, a lot of people, I don't like to run, but if you pull me out and you get me to run, you know, I'll probably poop out because I don't feel like doing it maybe before I physically can't. So your sense of what you could do actually impacts what you actually do. And coffee makes you feel like you could do more, and so you do. The caveat to this is the timing's important. So if you have a big game, say you're a tennis player and you've got a 3 o'clock match, and you have a big cup of coffee, you know, at 7 in the morning, that is not helping you for your 3 o'clock game, because the benefits are relatively soon after you drink it and they don't last that long. So although I don't recommend drinking coffee later in the day, if you wanted to take it to, say, spruce up your tennis game, I would have, if you have a 3 o'clock game, maybe have it at 2:15, something like that. And then you should enjoy the benefits of it. Although obviously, normally you want to have it earlier in the day. So coffee improves athletic performance. I recommend it, but it needs to be relatively close to when you're actually having the athletic performance.
Yeah, it's a fast-acting product. How many, so when we're talking about drinking coffee, can we get a little bit of a range in terms of how much coffee can we drink? When is it what proportion is beneficial, and when does it become too much?
Well, that's a great question. Now, I'm going to assume that you're only drinking coffee and you're not taking other things like caffeine pills or energy drinks or something like that. If all you're having is coffee, you probably could have up to like 5, maybe 6 cups a day. And in fact, some of the studies—
I'm assuming this is Americano, you know, American coffee, not 5 espressos.
Yeah, maybe like a 6 ounce, 8 ounce cup of coffee. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending this for most people, and truthfully, it'd be hard to drink that much and still be done around noon, you know, so you can go to sleep. But you probably can get away with like 5 cups a day. And some of the studies that looked at long-term benefits, the people that actually got the most benefits were people that were having like 4 or 5 cups a day in terms of like brain and heart health. But if you're having 1, 2, 3 cups a day, you know, that's no problem. Where you get into trouble is if you're merging a whole bunch of different caffeine sources, like you're taking caffeine pills and you're doing all these other things, plus having coffee, then you could be getting way too much caffeine, which I do not recommend.
Got it. I'm going to switch gear a little bit because we had quite a few questions related to weight control and aesthetic sport. So the first one was, in my sport, I have to keep a very lean figure for aesthetic purposes, and so I restrict what I eat. Is that healthy?
This is a big problem. You know, it's a big problem because I think this is one of those areas that women athletes are really in a tough spot. And I think it hurts women athletes a lot more than male athletes. And this issue of weight, and we really need to pay more attention to this for women's sports. And it's just unfair that women aren't getting the attention they deserve for these types of issues. So the problem is most women athletes, there's a large fraction of women athletes, well, maybe not most, but at least 25% of women athletes, maybe more, are significantly calorie depleted. They're not getting enough calories to begin with. And there may be a number of reasons for this, including the fact that they're under societal pressure not to eat more. Many of them may have eating disorders. They're doing sports that burn tons of calories and they're not making up for it. There's a number of reasons for this. when women aren't getting enough calories, they could have this triad that we talked about earlier, which is they're calorie depleted, which could hurt their performance. They are potentially missing periods, or their periods are irregular, which can have long-term health effects. And they're greater risk for osteoporosis and bone problems. So women not getting enough calories is a serious problem. So the question is, how do you balance this when you're doing an aesthetic sport? How do you get enough calories, but still keep the appearance that you need and keep the energy level that you need? And this is one of those things that's really very sort of person to person dependent. You know, everybody's a little bit different, but there are a few simple things you could do that really apply to almost everybody. And one of them is the calories you do get shouldn't come from sugar any more than necessary. So if you're only getting, let's say, 2,000 calories a day, and you should be getting more, I don't want to see 500 of those calories coming from your sugary energy drinks and dessert. You want your calories to come from real sources, especially if you're not getting enough calories anyways. But the second thing is, this is an example where I would probably work with a nutritionist to really make sure, to really look and see how many calories you're getting and does it meet your needs? Because the number of calories that you should be getting is very dependent on your age, and it's dependent on your weight and size, and it's dependent on the sport you play. So I think that this is very individualized. I would speak to a nutritionist about this, especially if you're kind of hovering at the border, or you're too low, or you have symptoms like irregular periods.
And I think this is one, it's very, very common with a lot of athletes, especially during puberty, but we also see the two sides. You'll have the athletes who are trying to eat but cannot get enough and still remain pretty slim. And then you have those who are eating and cannot keep the weight down for their sport. I feel like coaches are dealing with those two extremes, and it's hard to tell something to one person and something different to another person when you're in the same team. So the recommendation of going to the nutritionist to really individualize the answer is super important.
There's something I want to add to that, because you bring up a really good point, Miriam. And I just want to introduce a concept that a lot of people don't think about, but is big here. There's this idea of calorie density to foods. Calorie density. And so what that means is, for a certain amount of food, does it have a lot of calories per volume versus something else? So let me give you a couple examples. So if you have some raisins, for example, they're very calorically dense. You don't have to eat that many raisins. You can eat a small volume of raisins and you get a whole bunch of calories. Whereas, raisins are made from grapes. You could eat a lot more grapes, a bigger volume of grapes, and you get less calories. So grapes are less calorie dense than raisins, for example. Or if you have, say, a protein bar or a dessert like a brownie, those things are very calorie dense. I don't eat a lot of protein bars, but I've got a few. I've got some in my pantry. They've got like 220 calories or something for a little bar. Now I could eat that little bar, in a minute. And I've just wolfed down 220 calories because it is very calorie dense. But other things, like even a banana, for example, is much less calorie dense. So things like a banana, and everybody thinks bananas are sugary, but they've got what, like 80, 100 calories or something like that. So compare a banana to my protein bars. The protein bar is smaller and it has double the number of calories as the banana. Or even things like apples versus, say, apple juice. Apple juice has a lot of calories, and you could wolf down apple juice in a second. Anyone who has kids will tell you this is true. Apples, they take a while to eat and they don't have that much calorie density. So an apple, again, may have like 80 calories or something like that. Now you could sit down, I guarantee you, if I poured you some apple juice, you could drink 300, 400, 500 calories of apple juice in a flash if you wanted to. Try to eat 500 calories of apples. You won't be able to do it. You'll be eating apples all day. So one concept I would give is use this to your advantage. So if you're someone who is underweight and you're not getting enough calories, you might want to eat more calorie dense foods. I'm not saying junk food, but more calorie dense foods. If you're overweight and you're trying to bring your calories down, one simple thing is eat less calorie dense food. Switch from raisins to grapes, for example. Switch from apple juice to apples. And this one change gives you a lot of power over the amount of calories in your diet.
That's a fantastic tip. And I not only it's good for athletes, but I think for the coaches as well, to talk to their athlete of, you know, calorie per volume or calorie dense fruit and vegetables. I think it's really, really interesting. And it goes in line with one of the questions we had was, my coach keep complaining that I'm overweight, but I'm always hungry. What should I do? And I think this could be also one of the answers. You can eat more calorie dense foods to fill you up better, right? Using that same process.
Right. So if you're always hungry, what I would recommend is you want to eat things like, instead of having applesauce, which is dense in calories, I would just have apples. You know, you want to eat the less dense foods, because the idea is when you eat the less dense foods, it's a bigger volume. So for example, if I'm eating 1,000 calories of calorie dense foods, you know, I might have a couple protein bars and some raisins and I'm done for the day. If you're eating 1,000 calories of food that's not calorie dense, you're eating a massive meal. You're eating salads and you're eating apples and bananas and spinach and tofu and all these things. And you're going to eat a lot more food than I will, because the stuff you're eating is not dense and the stuff I'm eating is. So one tip I would give to someone who's trying to lose weight is try to eat these foods that are not that calorie dense, because you can chew on them all day if you want. I mean, you could eat, you know, everybody makes fun of this, but you could eat as much celery as you want. You're not going to get overweight from celery, because celery is not calorie dense. So find things that are not calorie dense that you like and add them to your diet. The other thing is you want to add more fiber to your diet, because fiber helps fill you up and makes you feel less hungry. So if you're someone who's hungry all the time, but you're trying to lose weight, eat foods with more fiber in them, which again kind of leads you back to vegetables, some fruits, whole grains, things like that, because the fiber fills you up. The fiber itself isn't caloric and it's good for you. So I think those are things. And then the other thing is, a lot of people find that when you add some protein to your meal or some fat to your meal, you stay full longer. So, you know, if you're going to eat crackers, which, you know, I wouldn't do too often, but if you are, if you put hummus on them or you put almond butter on them or cheese or something like that, then you'll get more full and you won't get hungry as fast.
Great, super answers. Thank you so much. One last question. We're getting close to the end of our chat today. My trainer is telling me to drink a protein shake several times per day. Will this help my performance? Question one. And two, I feel like this is more for football players and I'm running track. Does it have any benefit for me as a track runner?
Great questions. And this is another, you talked about controversial stuff. Protein is about as controversial as it gets for athletes. Yeah. So again, what I'm going to tell you, you're going to find people that might disagree. But I want to first start by just saying a general thing about protein. It's probably true for non-athletes, especially as you get older, that eating a bunch of protein, like say you're 40 or 50 or something like that, eating a bunch of protein, like more than you need, is not good for you. And I'm very anti-aging medicine. In fact, I wrote a book on it, Why Doctors Skip Breakfast. And one of the things that we're finding is that when people eat a lot of protein, it ages them quicker. It turns on the genes in your body that are more for growth and aging, and it turns off the genes that are more for repair and rejuvenation. So for an average non-athlete, say like me, for example, I don't want to eat too much protein. And so for someone like me, and I know this isn't a question, but I just want to set this background, this is important. For someone like me, having 5 protein shakes a day would be a terrible mistake, because I'd be getting way too much protein and it'll age me and it won't have any benefit. Okay, now let's talk specifically about women athletes. a lot of women athletes are probably not getting enough protein. Certainly if they're vegetarian or vegan, they probably aren't, but a lot of other ones aren't too. And how much protein you get is kind of individualized, but it's probably, as a woman athlete, competitive athlete, you probably want to get around 90-ish grams of protein a day, more or less. And so, if your protein shake has like 30 grams and you're having 3, 4, 5 of them, you're already probably getting more protein than you need. So I would say for most women athletes, you probably don't need multiple protein shakes a day. It's probably more than you require, and it's probably causing you to get too much protein. So I don't necessarily recommend it. Now, the part of the question about if you're a male athlete, like a football player or a male weightlifter, then yeah, maybe you want to get extra protein because there's some evidence that protein improves weightlifting performance and improves muscle mass. So for someone like that, maybe it makes sense. But I think for a woman athlete, most of the time, if you want to have 1, 2 protein shakes a day, that's fine. If you're vegetarian or vegan, maybe 3, but I don't think I would do any more than that. But this is also one of those things that a log is helpful. I know I keep going back to this, but if you track the days you've had a bunch of protein, either you had a steak or you had a bunch of protein shakes, and you also track how your athletic performance was that day, you could see if the protein shakes are helping you, at least in the short term, and adjust. But I think for most women athletes, probably 2 protein shakes a day is probably the most I would have, unless they're vegan.
Would you consider those protein shakes as a replacement for their protein intake during meals, or would that be in addition to the protein intake?
Well, so this is where I think counting protein helps, which is a great question. So again, I'll use myself as an example. So a lot of days I don't eat meat. If it's a day I don't eat fish or dairy products, I'm probably not eating that much protein. I'm eating some almonds and maybe some tofu or something, maybe some brown rice. So for me, like on a day like that, I'll have a protein bar or a protein shake because it's replacing protein I should be eating in my diet, but I'm not. If you're a woman athlete and your diet is like mine, you're going to want to have even more protein than I do, and you're going to want to probably have some protein shakes or protein bars. On the other hand, if you're a woman athlete and you're eating chicken regularly and you're eating almonds throughout the day and you're getting a bunch of protein from your diet, then I don't think you need the protein shakes, or maybe 1 protein shake a day. And I think the best thing to do, and I would just do this for a week, there's a whole bunch of free apps where you could track your intake. You just write down what you had for the day, and you could see how much protein is in your regular diet. If you're eating, 5 chicken breasts, for lunch, and you're eating 3 eggs in the morning, and you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for your snack and a steak for dinner, you're getting more protein than you need. I guarantee it. But the app will show you. But I think for most people, again, it varies a bit by sport and by age, but somewhere around 90 grams of protein a day for women athletes is about right.
That makes sense. That makes sense. That was very clear. We're kind of running out of time here, Greg, and I'm looking if anybody has any further question to ask. We have a few more minutes. I've gone through my list of questions that we had received. Anybody else? Okay. All right. Well, we've covered a lot of different topics, and it was a great discussion to follow the discussion that we had on female hormones, because the two are fairly linked, and there was a lot of overlap. So that was really interesting to hear your comments and feedback. For the audience, if you have any further questions after this event, feel free to email me, and I can ask those questions to Dr. Greg, or we can cover them in our next call. So feel free to do that. Greg, thank you so much for the time and the detailed answer. Really appreciate it. And we will be chatting again in 1 month with a different topic.
Yeah, Miriam, thanks for having me. Thanks for the great questions. And for those in the audience, if you find this useful, please share it with your friends, with your coach, with your teammates. We'd love to have you all on board with us and to ask questions and to join in. The Women's Sports Forum is all about you, and that's why Miriam and I and our whole gang are here. So thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great. We'll send the information for the Women's Sports Forum in our email with the link to the website, as well as the recording of all of our events. And yes, please share with others. And thank you again for taking the time. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.